September 1942. 3 o'clock in the morning. The Woolwich Arsenal underground research bunker buried 40 feet beneath the soil of South London. John Talbot has not slept in 6 days. He has not gone home. He has not changed his clothes. His shirt is stained with pencil graphite and coffee. His hands shake when he holds a pen. The bunker is cold and damp and smells like machine oil and desperation. There is only one fluorescent light on. Talbot sits at a metal desk covered in calculations. On the wall behind him are blueprints of tank systems. British tank systems that are failing. British tank systems that are getting soldiers killed. The War Office called Talbot 14 months ago. They told him that British Crusader tanks were losing to German Panther tanks despite having tactical advantage. They told him the Crusaders were getting destroyed in North Africa. They told him the reason was simple. The fire control system was too slow. A gun crew needed 20 seconds to calculate the shooting angle and adjust the gun. A German gun crew needed 10 seconds. That 5-second difference meant death. That 5 seconds meant watching a German shell tear through your tank. That 5 seconds meant your wife becomes a widow. That 5 seconds meant your son never meets his father again. The War Office needed a system that would calculate automatically instead of requiring a gun crew to do mathematics by hand during combat. Talbot said he would build it. That was the first mistake. Talbot built the system. It took 13 months. The hydraulic mechanism was revolutionary. The mechanical calculator was precise to within 1/10 of a degree. The gun crew could now calculate and fire in 8 seconds instead of 20. The test results were spectacular. British tanks suddenly matched German tanks in speed of fire. The War Office approved production. 2,000 tanks would be equipped within 6 months. Talbot was told he had saved British lives. Talbot was told he was a hero. Then 6 days ago, Talbot was reviewing the test data again because he always reviews the test data again. And Talbot saw it, a single flaw in the system. Actually, not a flaw, a limitation. The hydraulic pump was misaligned by 3 degrees. The pressure distribution was unequal, which meant the system was working well, which meant the system was not working at full capacity. Talbot ran the calculation if he adjusted the pump alignment by exactly 3 degrees, if he recalibrated the pressure release valve, if he redesigned the mechanical linkage, then the system would fire 2.7 times faster than the current version. Not twice as fast. 2.7 times. Almost 3 times the speed. Talbot checked the mathematics 5 times. He was not mistaken. 2.7 times faster meant a gun crew could fire 6 rounds in the time a current crew could fire 2. Talbot then calculated what 6 times would mean in combat. If 2,000 tanks were equipped with this improvement, if they engaged German tanks, if each British tank fired 3 times as fast, then statistically, more German tanks would be destroyed, not just more, 3 times more. Mathematically speaking, this improvement would save the lives of 3,000 British soldiers, and it would kill approximately 9,000 German soldiers instead of 3,000. Talbot did not want to do this calculation, but he did it anyway. He began searching through the classified archives. He wanted to understand why a system like this had not been proposed already. He wanted to understand if there was a technical reason, or if there was another type of reason. He found the memo at 2 o'clock in the morning. The memo was dated 1938. The memo was classified top secret. The memo was from Klaus Brenner. Klaus Brenner was the chief weapons engineer for the German Wehrmacht. Klaus Brenner had proposed the exact same improvement to the German tank fire control system. Klaus Brenner calculated that the improvement would increase firing efficiency by 2.7 times. Klaus Brenner then wrote a single sentence of rationale for why the improvement should be rejected. The sentence read, quote, "The implementation of this modification creates a tactical capability that exceeds acceptable ethical military doctrine, and I cannot in good conscience advance this technology further." End quote. Talbot read this sentence 11 times. Ethical military doctrine, ethics and warfare, two concepts that do not exist in the same universe. Talbot held the memo in his hands, and his hands began to shake. Klaus Brenner, a man on the other side of the war, a man Talbot would never meet, a man that Talbot should hate. And Klaus Brenner looked at the exact same calculation and said, no. Klaus Brenner looked at the ability to kill more enemy soldiers and said no. Klaus Brenner chose something called ethical military doctrine over tactical advantage. And Klaus Brenner was probably alive somewhere in Germany. And Klaus Brenner was probably regretting his decision. And Klaus Brenner's tanks were still slower than they could be. And Klaus Brenner's soldiers were still dying because his system was not as fast as it could be. Did Klaus Brenner save any lives by refusing to advance the technology? Or did Klaus Brenner only delay the inevitable and push the decision forward to someone else? Did Klaus Brenner do anything except make himself feel better? There is a sound on the stairs. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, military boots on concrete. Talbot does not look up from the Klaus Brenner memo. The footsteps stop outside the bunker door. The door opens. A man enters. The man is in a military uniform, a colonel's insignia. The colonel's face is serious. The colonel walks directly to Talbot's desk and places a manila folder on top of the blueprints. The colonel says nothing. Talbot looks at the folder. The colonel says we received intelligence from our sources inside Germany. The intelligence indicates that German engineers are currently working on a fire control system improvement. The improvement appears to match our specifications exactly. The German system is approximately 1 month ahead of schedule. The colonel says the War Office has made a decision. They need the improved system within 30 days, not within 6 months. 30 days. The colonel says if we do not complete the system in 30 days, then we lose the technological advantage. The colonel says if we lose the advantage, then German tanks will be twice as good as ours, and we will lose the war in North Africa. The colonel says this is not a request. This is an order. Implement the improvement now. Talbot looks at the Klaus Brenner memo. Talbot looks at the colonel. Talbot does not speak. The colonel turns to leave and stops. The colonel says, Talbot, I read your file. I know you turned down a commission in the military. I know you chose to be a civilian engineer instead. I know you said you wanted to design bridges, not weapons. The colonel says, but that choice is over now. You are a weapons engineer whether you wanted to be or not. The colonel says in 30 days I will be back, and you will have the plans for the improved system, or you will be arrested for refusing a direct military order during wartime. The colonel leaves. Talbot sits alone in the bunker with the Klaus Brenner memo and the manila folder and the knowledge that in 30 days 2,000 tanks will start firing 3 times as fast as they do now. Talbot has a choice, but the choice is not what he thought it was. The choice is not whether to build the improvement. The choice is whether Klaus Brenner was correct or whether Klaus Brenner was a coward. Talbot stands up. Talbot walks to a cabinet and pulls out a fresh sheet of engineering paper. Talbot begins to write. The specifications for the improved hydraulic system, the calculation for the new alignment, the design for the faster mechanism. Talbot works through the night. By dawn, the first complete design is finished. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the bunker door opens again. It is William Price. Price is Talbot's assistant. Price is 22 years old. Price has not slept either. Price knows why. Price sits down across from Talbot. Price picks up the Klaus Brenner memo. Price reads it. Price sets it down and says one word. Why? Talbot does not answer. Price says it again. Why would you build something like this? Talbot says the colonel came. The colonel said they have 30 days. Price says, I do not care what the colonel said. I am asking why you personally would choose to do this. Talbot looks at Price and realizes that he has no answer, because the true answer is that Talbot does not know. Talbot only knows that Klaus Brenner's decision to refuse was not brave. It was just slow. It was just pushing the problem to someone else, and Talbot has decided that he will not be Klaus Brenner. Talbot will build the system, Talbot will own the decision, and Talbot will have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. 28 days. Talbot has exactly 28 days to complete the fire control system improvement. The testing facility is in Essex, outside a village called Danbury, a concrete building surrounded by barbed wire and guards. The facility is built specifically for weapons testing, but nobody talks about what is tested here. The tank sits inside a reinforced hangar, a Crusader tank. The hydraulic pump is exposed. Every component is visible. Every component is measurable. Everything is ready to be modified, and nothing about what is going to happen is acceptable. On day 1, Robert Fleming arrives. Fleming is 41 years old. Fleming designed fire control systems for British battleships. He spent 15 years calculating trajectories and angles. He designed systems that worked perfectly on ships that weighed 40,000 tons. Fleming is brilliant. Fleming is careful. Fleming is meticulous. When Fleming walks around the tank, he touches nothing. He only looks. After 2 hours, Fleming pulls Talbot aside and says, "John, this is different than ships. On ships, the gun fires once or twice. The crew has time between shots. On this tank, the gun fires continuously." Fleming says, "I see what you want to do." Fleming says, "I understand the mathematics." Fleming says, "But I have to ask you something." Fleming says, "When this system breaks under stress, where will the gun crew be?" Talbot says the system will not break. Fleming says, "You cannot promise that." Fleming says, "We are asking the hydraulic lines to handle pressures they were never designed for." Fleming says at some point something will rupture. Talbot says yes. At some point something might rupture, but we will design the containment so the tank remains operational. Fleming stares at Talbot for a long moment. Fleming says, "You are not really answering the question." Fleming says, "I am asking if you have calculated how many gun crews will die when this system fails in combat." Talbot does not answer. Fleming repeats his question. Talbot finally says the answer is some number. The number is larger than 0. The number is less than the number of British soldiers who will die if we do not build this improvement. Talbot says so. I choose the smaller number. That is the calculation. James Harrow arrives on day 2. Harrow is 36. Harrow designed mechanical calculators for aircraft. Harrow solved problems that 3 other engineers could not solve. Harrow is the best mechanical engineer Talbot knows. When Harrow sees the hydraulic system, he sits down and does not speak for 20 minutes. Harrow then asks where the fail-safe mechanism is. Talbot says there is no fail-safe. The system is designed for speed, not safety. Harrow says you cannot build a weapon system without fail-safes. Talbot says I can and I will. Talbot says the system needs to function at maximum capacity. That means no redundancy, no backup systems, maximum speed. Harrow says that is not engineering, that is gambling. Talbot says yes, that is exactly what this is. William Price arrives on day 2 also. Price has not spoken to Talbot since the testing facility was announced. Price walks directly to the tank and begins inspecting components without greeting anyone. Talbot tries to speak to Price. Talbot says we need to discuss the installation sequence. Price does not respond. Price continues inspecting. Talbot says the pressure recalibration takes priority. Price continues inspecting. For the next 6 hours, Talbot watches Price work and Price does not speak once. When work stops for the day, Price leaves without saying goodnight. The redesign of the hydraulic pump begins on day 3. Fleming works the pump specifications. Harrow works the mechanical linkage. Price works the pressure containment. Talbot supervises. They need to create a pump that can handle 8% additional pressure for extended periods. They test 17 different pump configurations. Configurations 1 through 4 fail catastrophically. The hydraulic lines rupture. Fluid sprays everywhere. The tests destroy equipment. Fleming watches each failure. Fleming says nothing. The failures are his predictions coming true. Configurations 5 through 11 fail more slowly. Cracks appear. The systems last 6 to 12 hours before breakdown. On day 6, configuration 12 succeeds. The pump holds pressure for 16 hours straight. No failures, no leaks. But then 12 fails, and 13 fails, and 14 and 15 fail. On day 9, they find configuration 16. Configuration 16 holds pressure for 36 hours. It is selected. Then on day 10, Harrow discovers a problem. Harrow is testing the mechanical linkage and notices stress fractures forming on the secondary connections. Harrow shows Talbot the components. The fractures are small. The fractures are only millimeters long, but the fractures are expanding. Harrow says if these connections break under combat stress, then the turret cannot rotate. The gun cannot aim. The tank becomes useless. Talbot looks at the fractures. Talbot says we need to reinforce the connections. Harrow says we do not have time. We have 11 days left. Harrow says to properly redesign these connections takes 3 weeks. Talbot says then we do not redesign. We reinforce. We add bracing. We add secondary support. We wrap the connections. We make the mechanical system so strong that the stress fractures cannot expand. Harrow says that is not a solution, that is a temporary patch. Talbot says yes, it is a temporary patch, but it will hold during testing. After we complete the test and receive approval, we can redesign properly. Harrow shakes his head. Harrow says you know what you are doing. You are building a tank fire control system that might fail during the first time it is used in real combat. Talbot says the alternative is building nothing and losing the war. Harrow walks away. Fleming approaches Talbot later that night. Fleming says, I calculated the failure probabilities. Fleming says, based on the stress patterns, if this system is used in continuous firing for more than 4 hours, there is approximately a 7% chance of critical hydraulic failure. Fleming says that 7% means 1 in 14 tanks will fail during a sustained engagement. Fleming says 1 in 14 tanks means approximately 100 gun crews will lose functionality. Fleming says 100 gun crews losing functionality in combat means those crews are vulnerable. Fleming says vulnerable gun crews in tanks die. Talbot listens. Talbot says yes. And if we do not build this system, then all 14 tanks are less effective. Then all 14 tanks are more likely to lose to German tanks. Then probably 500 gun crews die instead of 100. Fleming says that is your calculation. Talbot says that is my calculation. Fleming says, then I hope you can live with it. By day 24, the mechanical reinforcements are complete. By day 25, the pressure containment redesign is finished. By day 26, all component integration is complete. The system is ready to test. Price brings Talbot the final installation report. It is 40 pages. Price has documented every component, every specification, every possible failure point. At the bottom of the report, Price has written a single sentence. Price writes, quote, "This system will function as designed until it does not end." Quote. Price hands the report to Talbot. Price still has not spoken in 11 days. Talbot tries to speak. Talbot says, "Price, this is necessary." Price turns away. Price says, "I know it is necessary." Price says, "That is what makes it worse." On day 28, the test begins. The test tank is positioned 100 meters from the target. The target is a disabled German Panther tank. The tank gun does not fire. The tank does not move. But the tank is real. 5 gunners sit inside the test tank. 5 men, 5 families. The gunners have been trained for this moment. The training is mechanical. The training does not discuss what they are about to demonstrate. Talbot stands in the bunker with Fleming, Harrow, and Price. The radio crackles. The gunner says ready. The tank commander says commence firing. The gun fires. 1 round. The round hits the Panther. The gun immediately reloads. 2 seconds pass. The gun fires again. Round 2 hits the Panther. The recoil system absorbs the impact. The hydraulic system calculates. Round 3 in 4 seconds. The Panther is struck. Round 4. The Panther turret begins to smoke. Round 5. Round 6. Rounds 7 and 8 strike in rapid succession. By round 10, the Panther looks like it is falling apart. Metal splinters. Fire erupts from internal compartments. The gun continues firing. Round 11. Round 12. The gunner requests permission to cease fire. The tank commander refuses. The test continues. Round 15. Round 16. The Panther is beyond comprehension now. It is rubble. By round 22, the test concludes. The target tank is completely destroyed. Nothing remains. Fleming smiles. Harrow says nothing. Price looks at the ground. Talbot walks out of the bunker toward the tank. He touches the still warm hull. The metal is hot. The system generated enormous heat. The system fired 22 rounds in exactly 93 seconds. Under the old system, 93 seconds would produce approximately 9 rounds. This system produced 22 rounds. This system killed in a way that was not previously possible. That night, Talbot receives a message from the War Office, approved for immediate production. 2,000 tanks will be equipped. Deployment begins next month. Estimated German tank kills will increase by approximately 300%. Estimated British soldier casualties will decrease by 22%. Estimated German soldier casualties will increase by 414%. Outstanding technical achievement. Production commences immediately. Talbot reads the numbers 3 times. 300% more German tanks destroyed. 414% more German soldiers dead. The system worked. The system achieved its purpose perfectly. Talbot sets the message down. Price stands near the window. Price has not left the bunker. Talbot says, "Price, we did what was necessary." Price turns. Price says, "John, you know what Fleming calculated. You know 100 gun crews might fail in this tank. You know that means some of those crews will die. You know that was acceptable to you." Price says, "And I want you to understand something." Price says, "That acceptance you made, that calculation you made, you will carry that forever." Price says, "Every British soldier who dies from a failed system, every German soldier who dies from this system firing 22 rounds instead of 9 rounds. You built the technology that made those deaths possible." Price says Klaus Brenner decided he could not build this weapon. Klaus Brenner said no to something that was theoretically superior. Klaus Brenner chose conscience over calculation. Talbot says Klaus Brenner was wrong. Price says Klaus Brenner is not the one you have to convince. North Africa. June 1944. The desert is absolute. Sand covers everything. The sun has been burning the earth for 6 hours. The first improved fire control systems arrived at the North African Theater 3 weeks ago. The tanks equipped with the new system are now operational. The unit is commanded by Captain James Whitmore. Whitmore is 27 years old, but his face looks older. Whitmore has been in combat for 18 months. Whitmore has learned that preparation means nothing in combat. Whitmore has learned that order and chaos are the same thing. Whitmore has learned that men do not die in the way you expect them to die. This morning, Whitmore received new orders. Find German armor. Engage. Do not retreat. At 6 o'clock in the morning, 10 British tanks moved north into the open desert. Whitmore commands from the lead tank. Whitmore's radio crackles with reports from the other 9 tanks. All systems operational. All crews ready. All men afraid. The fear is professional. The fear is necessary. The fear is the thing that keeps soldiers alive. At 8:30 in the morning, the radio operator says contact. Germans at 2 kilometers. 3 Panther tanks dug into a ridge. Whitmore looks at the ridge. Whitmore calculates distances. Whitmore calculates the vulnerability of his position. Whitmore understands that in 80 seconds his unit will begin taking fire from 3 directions. Whitmore says, "Advance." The 10 tanks move forward. Sand rises behind them. The heat rises. The first shot comes from the German position at 800 meters. The shell arrives before the sound. The sound comes a fraction of a second later. The first British tank in the formation is struck. The shell punches through the frontal armor. The impact is catastrophic. The tank explodes violently. The explosion sends the 5-ton turret spinning through the air. The tank becomes a fireball. The men inside the tank are dead before they understand what has happened. The explosion ends. Only smoke remains. 9 tanks continue forward. Whitmore's hands are steady on the radio. Whitmore says, "Continue forward." Whitmore's hands are steady, but inside his body, Whitmore is counting. Whitmore is counting how many men he just lost. Whitmore is counting how many wives will receive telegrams. The German guns fire again. 800 meters now, 700. The second British tank is hit. The shell does not destroy it immediately. The shell punches through the side armor, and something inside begins burning. Fire erupts from the turret hatch. The driver feels the heat. The driver opens the emergency hatch and jumps. The gunner follows. The tank commander jumps last. The tank burns as it rolls forward 70 meters and stops. The 3 survivors run from the burning tank toward the remaining column. 8 tanks remain. Whitmore orders the assault forward. The 8 tanks accelerate. The men inside the tanks can hear the German guns firing. The men inside the tanks can feel the impacts hitting the armor around them. The men inside the tanks are waiting to die. The first British tank reaches 600 meters. The gunner inside receives the firing command. The mechanical calculator activates. The system that Talbot designed processes the angles. The hydraulic pump pushes pressure through the lines. The gun fires. The round travels 500 meters in 2 seconds. The impact is direct. The German Panther is struck. The shell penetrates the armor. Inside the Panther, there is an explosion. The Panther begins burning. The gunner inside the first British tank does not wait to observe the result. The system reloads automatically. The system calculates. The gun fires again. 1 second later, another round hits the Panther. The German tank is destroyed. 1 destroyed. The British gunner breathes. The British gunner thinks for a moment about the men inside the German tank. The British gunner thinks about wives and mothers and children, learning that someone they loved is dead. The British gunner does not have time to think. The system reloads. The command comes. The gun fires again at the second German target. The second British tank engages the second Panther. The system fires. Reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. The new system is faster than human thought. The new system is faster than fear. The new system is faster than hesitation. The rhythm is mechanical and relentless. A German shell hits the second British tank on the turret. The shell does not penetrate, the armor holds. The impact is violent, but the tank survives. The British gunner inside continues firing. The second Panther is hit multiple times. German fire is less accurate. German fire is slower. German fire is being overwhelmed by the new system. The third Panther attempts to retreat. The Panther turns backward. The Panther accelerates. A British tank on the left flank acquires the target. The system calculates. The gun fires. Reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. 7 rounds in rapid succession. The retreating Panther is struck repeatedly. Fire erupts along the rear. The Panther slows. The Panther stops. The engagement ends. 4 minutes and 11 seconds from first fire to final destruction. 3 German Panther tanks disabled or destroyed. All 3 struck multiple times. The German tanks fired 4 times total. The British tanks fired 28 times total. Whitmore looks at the numbers from his command tank. The numbers are better than expected. The numbers mean tactical victory. The numbers mean the new system worked perfectly. The numbers also mean something else. Whitmore orders the advance stopped. Whitmore drives forward to the burning tanks. The third British tank is still burning. The crew is gone. Everything is ash and smoke and the smell of burning men. Whitmore looks inside and sees nothing. Whitmore sees only the mechanism of death. The gunner from the second tank sits on the ground. His face is burned. His neck is burned. His right arm is burned. The burns are severe. The burns are the color of charcoal. The burns smell like cooking meat. The gunner's name is James Cordell. Cordell is 24 years old. Cordell is looking at his hands. Cordell does not recognize his hands. Cordell does not feel his hands. Cordell is in shock. Whitmore sits next to Cordell. Whitmore says, "How are you?" Cordell does not respond. Whitmore says the system worked perfectly. Your tank performed exceptionally. We destroyed 3 enemy tanks. Cordell continues looking at his hands. Cordell finally speaks. Cordell says, "I remember the impact." Cordell says the shell hit us on the turret and I thought we were dead. Cordell says I could smell the burning and I thought I was burning, but I was firing. I was firing the gun over and over. I was firing the weapon that you designed. Cordell says I could feel my skin burning, but I kept firing. I kept firing because that was the job. I kept firing because the system reloads so fast. I kept firing because the gun never jammed. I kept firing because your system works. Whitmore says we won the engagement. Cordell says yes. We won. We destroyed 3 German tanks. We destroyed more Germans than we lost British soldiers. We killed 3 for 1. That is an acceptable ratio. Cordell looks at Whitmore. Cordell says, "Will my face grow back?" Whitmore does not answer. Whitmore does not know. Whitmore knows only that Cordell's face will not grow back, and Cordell will spend the rest of his life knowing that his face is not his own anymore. That evening, Whitmore receives the combat report from the War Office. The report says the new fire control system performed flawlessly. The report says 1 British unit equipped with the improved system destroyed 3 German tanks with acceptable casualty ratios. The report says the system will change the course of the war. The report congratulates Captain Whitmore on his unit's success. Whitmore reads the report. Whitmore then reads the casualty list. 42 British soldiers dead, 23 British soldiers wounded, 3 German tanks destroyed, estimated 43 German soldiers killed, estimated 67 German soldiers wounded. The mathematics are satisfied. The ratio is favorable. The calculation has been completed. Whitmore takes a photograph from the combat folder. The photograph shows James Cordell. Cordell's burned face. Cordell's empty eyes. The photograph captures nothing except the specific moment when a man understands that he will never be the person he was. Whitmore holds the photograph. Whitmore understands something in this moment. Whitmore understands that this photograph will exist forever. Whitmore understands that somewhere in London, an engineer named Talbot will see this photograph. Whitmore places the photograph in an envelope. Whitmore addresses the envelope to the War Office Technical Division. Whitmore does not write a message. 2,000 miles away in London, John Talbot arrives at his office. The morning is gray. The office is cold. Talbot's assistant hands him a sealed envelope. The envelope has no return address. Talbot opens it. Inside is a single photograph. The photograph shows a man with burned skin covering his face and neck and arms. The photograph shows empty eyes. The photograph shows nothing except consequence. Talbot looks at the photograph for 5 minutes. Talbot does not move. Talbot does not speak. Talbot places the photograph face down on his desk. 1 minute later, the telephone rings. It is Colonel Harrison from Military Intelligence. Harrison says, "Talbot, I have news about the first engagement with the improved fire control system. The engagement was successful. 3 German tanks destroyed. Talbot says, I know. Talbot says, I am looking at the consequence." Harrison says, "What do you mean?" Talbot says, "Never mind." Talbot says, "I need to speak with you. I need to speak with you today. Come to my office immediately." Harrison arrives at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Harrison carries a file. Harrison says the German intelligence agencies have learned about the improved fire control system. The Germans are now working on a comparable system. The Germans will have a working prototype within 6 months. Harrison says the War Office views this as a critical situation. Harrison says we cannot allow the Germans to regain technological advantage. Harrison says the War Office requires a second-generation fire control system to be developed immediately. Harrison says they want the new system to improve firing speed by another 50%. Talbot looks at the photograph on his desk. Talbot says no. Harrison says no what? Talbot says no to the request. Talbot says, I will not design another system. Talbot says, I will not be a party to further improvements. Harrison says the War Office will not accept refusal. Talbot says then the War Office can find another engineer. Talbot says I have done what I was asked to do. Talbot says I have seen what my design does. Talbot points to the photograph. Talbot says this man is James Cordell. Cordell got burned because the fire control system is so effective that the tank became a tactical target. Cordell got burned because your strategy depends on the system performing perfectly every time. Cordell got burned because I built something that kills more efficiently. Talbot says I will not build it again. Harrison says the War Office will prosecute you for refusing direct military orders. Talbot says then, prosecute me. Talbot says, but I refuse. Harrison stares at Talbot. Harrison places the file on the desk. The file contains casualty reports from the North Africa engagement. The file contains strategic assessments. The file contains a recommendation for immediate development of a second-generation system. Harrison says, I need to tell you something before I leave. Harrison says that burned gunner. That man is going to survive, but he will never work again. That man will never have a normal face again. That man will spend the rest of his life looking in mirrors and seeing a stranger. Harrison says, do you know how many gunners like Cordell there are going to be if the Germans develop their system first? Do you know how many British soldiers will be burned, or blinded, or crippled? Do you know what happens if we fall behind? Talbot picks up the photograph. Talbot says, I understand what happens. Talbot says, I understand that the calculation never stops. Talbot says, I understand that every improvement creates new casualties. Talbot says, I refuse to be part of that cycle. Harrison picks up the file. Harrison walks to the door. Harrison stops at the door. Harrison says, Talbot, you are making a choice. You are choosing to refuse to build a weapon because you have seen what weapons do. Harrison says your sacrifice means nothing if someone else builds the weapon. Harrison says someone else will build it. Someone else will improve it. The cycle will continue without you. Your refusal only means that you do not get to choose how it is built. Your refusal only means that you are not responsible. But the weapon will still exist. The deaths will still happen. Your hands will still be on the trigger because you built the first system. Talbot does not answer. Harrison leaves. Talbot sits alone in his office. Talbot looks at the photograph of Cordell. Talbot opens his desk drawer. Talbot retrieves the Klaus Brenner memo, the memo that Talbot found in the archives years ago, the memo where Klaus Brenner refused to build an improvement. Talbot reads Brenner's words, quote, the implementation of this modification creates a tactical capability that exceeds acceptable ethical military doctrine, and I cannot in good conscience advance this technology further, end quote. Talbot understands now. Talbot understands what Brenner was saying. Talbot understands that Brenner was not weak. Talbot understands that Brenner was not a coward. Talbot understands that Brenner saw exactly what Talbot is seeing now. Brenner saw burned faces. Brenner saw empty eyes. Brenner saw the consequence of innovation. Brenner refused the first time. Talbot accepted the first time. Talbot is refusing the second time, but understanding arrives too late. The first weapon was already built. The first casualties have already happened. The photograph of Cordell on Talbot's desk is permanent evidence. Cordell's burned face will exist forever. Talbot did not intend for Cordell to be burned. Talbot did not intend for anyone to die. But intention means nothing in war. Intention is irrelevant. What matters is that Talbot built the system. What matters is that the system works exactly as designed. What matters is that the improvement meant more Germans died and more British soldiers like Cordell paid the price. Talbot holds the photograph and understands that he will carry this image for the rest of his life. Talbot understands that refusing now changes nothing. Talbot understands that he has to live with the weight of every choice he made and every consequence that choice created. Talbot places the photograph back on his desk. Talbot looks at the Klausbrenner memo one final time. Talbot understands now what it means to refuse. Talbot understands now what it means to say no. But Talbot understands too late. London, March 1946. The morning is gray. The office is cold. John Talbot does not look up when the envelope slides across his desk. Talbot knows what the envelope contains. Talbot knows because he has been expecting it. Talbot knows because there is no return address. Inside the envelope is a single letter. The letter is from a man named Robert Hutchins. Robert Hutchins is a British soldier. Robert Hutchins was 26 years old when the war ended. Robert Hutchins is 27 now. Robert Hutchins is blind. Robert Hutchins is blind because he was standing next to a tank when that tank was struck by German artillery. The tank was an improved tank. The tank had the fire control system that Talbot designed. The tank was so effective that it became a priority target. The German shell destroyed everything inside. Robert Hutchins survived. Robert Hutchins survived with no eyes. The letter reads, quote, "I do not know your name, but I know what you designed. I know because they told me in the hospital. They told me that my tank was equipped with the best fire control system in the world. They told me that we won the engagement. They told me that 3 German tanks were destroyed. They told me that my blindness was an acceptable casualty. They told me I should be proud." Unquote. Talbot stops reading. Talbot closes the letter. Talbot places the letter on his desk. Talbot picks up the telephone. Talbot calls the War Office. Talbot says he needs casualty records. Talbot says he needs casualty records for improved fire control systems. Talbot says he needs them today. The War Office official says such records take time. Talbot says today. Talbot hangs up the telephone. 3 hours later, the casualty records arrive. The records are in a box. The box contains thousands of pages. The pages list names. The pages list unit numbers. The pages list injuries. The pages list deaths. Talbot sits at his desk and reads the pages. Talbot reads about soldiers who were blinded. Talbot reads about soldiers who lost limbs. Talbot reads about soldiers who lost their minds. Talbot reads about soldiers who are dead. The numbers accumulate: 53, 120, 347, 809. Talbot stops counting. Talbot then pulls out a notebook. Talbot begins his own calculation. Talbot calculates combat engagements. Talbot calculates casualty ratios. Talbot calculates survival rates. Talbot multiplies and divides and subtracts. The calculation takes 4 days. The calculation never stops. Talbot works through the nights. Talbot does not sleep. By the 4th day, the calculation is complete. 23,500 British soldiers lived because of the improved fire control system. 31,800 German soldiers died because of it. 31,800? 31,800 families received telegrams. 31,800 mothers received news that their son would not return. 31,800 wives became widows. 31,800 children would never meet their fathers. Talbot writes the number on a piece of paper. Talbot writes it 20 times. Each time Talbot tries to feel something. Each time Talbot expects a reaction. Nothing comes. The number is too large to feel. The number is too abstract. Talbot crumples the paper. Talbot throws it away. Talbot retrieves it from the waste bin. Talbot smooths the paper flat. Talbot reads the number again. 31,800. That afternoon, William Price appears at Talbot's door. Price does not knock. Price enters the office. Price looks at Talbot and sees a man who has not slept in days. Price sees a man whose hands are shaking. Price sees a man who is counting the dead in his head. Price says, "John, I have been assigned to a new project. The project requires improvements to missile guidance. The War Office wants increased accuracy. The War Office wants it in 6 months. Price says they want you to consult." Talbot does not move. Talbot does not speak. Price sits down. Price sees the casualty records on the desk. Price sees Robert Hutchins' letter. Price picks up the letter. Price reads it. Price reads about blindness. Price reads about acceptable casualty. Price sets the letter down. Price says, "John, I know what you are thinking." Talbot finally speaks. Talbot says, "I am not helping. I will not help. I will not provide calculations. I will not consult on this project or any other project. I am finished." Price leans forward. Price says the system will be built without you. Someone else will build it. Someone else will make the calculations. Someone else will decide the acceptable casualty rate. Price says that person will not be as careful as you. That person will not think about Robert Hutchins. That person will not care about the 31,800. That person will build it because they are told to build it. Price says, and the deaths will happen anyway. The system will work anyway. The only difference is that you will not have the opportunity to minimize the damage. Talbot stands up. Talbot walks to the window. Talbot looks out at gray London. Talbot says, "Then the death is on their hands, not mine." Price stands up. Price says, "No, the death is already on your hands." Price says, "Because you built the first system." Price says, "Because you knew what it would do." Price says, "Because you chose to build it anyway." Price says, refusing to help with the second system does not erase the 31,800. It only adds to them. Talbot turns from the window. Talbot looks at Price. Talbot's face is completely gray. Talbot's eyes are empty. Talbot says, "William, you are telling me that I must help build weapons for the rest of my life because I built one weapon." Price says, "I am telling you that you cannot escape what you have chosen." Price says, refusing does not make you innocent. Price says, building does not make you guilty. Price says, only living with what you have done makes you honest. Price pulls out a folder. Price places it on Talbot's desk. Price says, inside this folder are the preliminary calculations. Inside are the projected casualty reductions. Inside are the projected casualty increases. Price says they are your calculations. I borrowed your methodology. I used your numbers. I ran your formulas. Price says, I want you to check my work. Price says, I want you to verify that my numbers are correct. Price says, and then I want you to tell me whether I should help finish this system or whether I should refuse. Talbot does not touch the folder. Talbot says, I will not do this. Price says, then, I will submit my calculations to the War Office without verification. I will submit calculations that may be wrong. I will submit calculations that might underestimate casualties or overestimate benefits. Price says, and if my calculations are wrong, then people will die unnecessarily. People will die because my calculations were careless. People will die because you chose to be righteous instead of responsible. Talbot picks up the folder. Talbot opens it. Inside are Price's calculations. The calculations are methodical. The calculations are precise. The calculations are wrong. Price miscalculated the force multiplier at 2 points. Price miscalculated casualty ratios at 3 points. Talbot sees the errors immediately. Talbot sees that Price's errors will result in approximately 8,000 additional deaths. 8,000 people who might live if the calculations are correct. 8,000 people who will die if the calculations remain wrong. Talbot sits down. Talbot pulls out his own notebook. Talbot begins correcting Price's work. Talbot works for 3 hours. Talbot corrects every error. Talbot verifies every calculation. Talbot creates a new set of numbers. When the work is complete, Talbot hands the corrected calculations to Price. Price looks at the work. Price sees the corrections. Price sees the dedication in Talbot's handwriting. Price understands what Talbot has just done. Talbot says, "William, your original numbers would have resulted in approximately 8,000 preventable deaths. These corrected numbers reduce that figure by approximately 40%. Talbot says, so I have just helped you save 3,200 lives. Or I have helped you kill 3,200 people. I do not know which. I do not think anyone knows which." Talbot says, "But I know that refusing to help you would have killed all 8,000. And that is the choice. That is always the choice. Not between right and wrong, but between different types of deaths." Price says, "Then you will continue to help?" Talbot says, "I will continue to help because the alternative is worse." Talbot says, "I will help because someone must make the calculation carefully." Talbot says, "I will help because if I do not, then someone careless will." Talbot says, "I will help, and I will carry this for the rest of my life." Price says, "Thank you." Talbot says, "Do not thank me." Talbot says, "You are asking me to become the man who calculates death for a living." Talbot says, "You are asking me to spend the rest of my life knowing exactly how many people died because of my choices." Talbot says, "You are asking me to wake up every morning understanding that I chose this." Price says, "Yes. That is exactly what I am asking." Price says, "Because someone must choose it. And if it is going to be chosen, then it should be chosen by someone who understands the weight." Price says Klaus Brenner refused once. Klaus Brenner refused, and it meant nothing. Someone else built the system. Someone else made the choice. Klaus Brenner lived in comfort thinking he had done the right thing. Klaus Brenner died believing his refusal mattered. Klaus Brenner was wrong. Price says, "But you are not Klaus Brenner. You are choosing to know the weight. You are choosing to carry it. You are choosing to build carefully instead of refusing and pretending your refusal matters." Price says, "That is harder. That is worse. That is the only honest choice." Talbot opens his desk drawer. Talbot retrieves a leather-bound notebook. The notebook is completely empty except for one entry. The entry is dated 9 months ago. The entry reads, quote, 23,500 British soldiers saved, 31,800 German soldiers dead. Unquote. Talbot opens the notebook to a new page. Talbot writes a new entry. The entry reads, quote, 8,000 additional British soldiers saved by corrected calculations. 2,480 German soldiers spared death by improved accuracy. Unquote. Talbot closes the notebook. Talbot holds it. Talbot understands now what this notebook will become. Talbot understands that this notebook will be filled with numbers for the rest of his life. Talbot understands that he will add to this notebook every time a system is improved, every time calculations are corrected, every time the weight becomes heavier. Talbot understands that he will never close this notebook. Talbot understands that he will carry this notebook until the day he dies. Talbot places the notebook on his desk. Talbot looks at Price. Talbot says, "I will need 6 months to develop the corrected system. I will need Fleming to help with the targeting algorithms. I will need Harrow to help with the mechanical improvements. I will need you to help me carry the weight." Price says they will help. Talbot says they will help, and they will understand what they are helping to do. Talbot says we will build this system carefully. We will calculate everything. We will minimize the casualties. We will do all of this while knowing that people will still die. We will do all of this while knowing that it is our fault. Price says yes, that is what we will do. Price says because someone must do it, and if someone must do it, then we are better equipped than most. Price says we understand the weight. Price says we understand that there is no innocence here. Price says we understand that choosing to build carefully is not redemption. It is only responsibility. Price says, and responsibility is the hardest thing to carry. Cambridge, September 1964. The autumn is cold and dry. The leaves are turning the color of old paper. John Talbot is 62 years old. Talbot has been alive for 62 years, but he looks like he has lived for 100. Talbot's hair is completely white. Talbot's hands shake constantly now. Talbot's hands shake because they have calculated so many deaths. Talbot works in a laboratory at Cambridge University. The laboratory is small and quiet. The laboratory contains instruments and calculators and notebooks. 32 notebooks. Talbot has filled 32 notebooks with calculations. Each notebook is labeled with a year. Each year represents another system improved. Each year represents another set of deaths recorded precisely. Talbot's son is named Edward. Edward is 34 years old. Edward is also an engineer. Edward works at the laboratory with his father. Edward did not choose to become an engineer. Edward did not choose to work with systems and calculations. Edward became an engineer because he is the son of John Talbot. Edward became an engineer because fate is inherited. Edward became an engineer because his father's weight has become his weight, whether Edward wanted it or not. Edward enters the laboratory at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Edward carries a folder. Edward's face is serious. Edward says, "Father, I need to speak with you about something important." Talbot does not look up from his calculations. Talbot continues writing numbers. Edward sits down and places the folder on the table. Edward says, "The War Office has contacted me. They have contacted me directly. They have not contacted you because they assumed you would refuse. Edward says they want me to design an improvement to the targeting system. They want me to create something that will increase accuracy by another 40%. Talbot finally looks up. Talbot sees his son sitting across the table. Talbot sees his son's face. Talbot sees that Edward is afraid. Talbot says no. Edward says, "Father, I have not finished." Talbot says, "I do not need you to finish. I know what they want. I know what the improvement will do. I know what you're going to ask me." Talbot says the answer is no. Edward opens the folder. Inside the folder are technical specifications. Inside are performance requirements. Inside are casualty projections. Edward says they have already done preliminary calculations. They estimate that the improvement will reduce British targeting error by approximately 38%. They estimate the improvement will increase British casualty reductions by approximately 10,000 lives. They estimate the improvement will increase enemy casualty increases by approximately 14,000 deaths. Talbot stands up. Talbot walks to the window. Talbot looks out at the Cambridge courtyard. Talbot says, "Edward, you are my son. You are my only son." Talbot says, "I have spent your entire life knowing exactly what my choices have cost. I have calculated every death. I have recorded every casualty. I have carried every number for your entire life." Talbot says, "I will not do the same to you." Talbot says, "You will not carry this weight." Edward says, "Father, I am already carrying it." Edward says, "I have spent my entire life watching you carry it." Edward says, "I have watched you sit at this table and fill these notebooks with dead people." Edward says, "I have watched you become thinner and older and more hollow because you know exactly what you have done." Edward stands up. Edward says, "I did not become an engineer by accident. I became an engineer to understand what you have done, to understand what this weight is, to understand why you chose this instead of refusal." Talbot turns from the window. Talbot looks at his son. Edward continues. Edward says, "I want to ask you something." Edward says, "Do you regret it? Do you regret building the first system? Do you regret making the choice to calculate carefully instead of refuse?" Talbot does not answer immediately. Talbot walks to the shelves where his notebooks are kept. Talbot counts them. 1, 2, 3. Talbot counts all the way to 32. Talbot says, "Edward, if I had refused the first time, then someone else would have built the system. Someone else would have made the calculations. Someone else would have built it carelessly. Talbot says, I chose to build it carefully. I chose to minimize the damage. I chose to know exactly what the damage was. Talbot turns back to Edward. Talbot says, was that the right choice? I do not know. I do not think the question has a right answer. Talbot says, what I know is this. I know that by my calculations, I prevented approximately 212,000 deaths. 212,000 people who live because I chose to be careful instead of careless. 212,000 families that have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren because I made the choice to build systems that kill efficiently instead of inefficiently. Talbot sits back down. Talbot says, but Edward, I also know this. I know that I caused directly and indirectly the deaths of approximately 387,000 people. 387,000. That is a larger number than 212,000. That is a larger number that I must live with. Talbot says, so the mathematics say that my choice resulted in approximately 175,000 net deaths. 175,000 more people are dead because I chose to optimize killing instead of refusing to kill. Edward sits down. Edward says, is that true? Did you really cause 175,000 deaths? Talbot nods. Talbot says yes. By the calculation, by the mathematics, by the logic of innovation and improvement and optimization. 175,000 people are dead because of my choices. Edward says that cannot be right. Edward says surely the calculation is wrong. Edward says surely refusing would have resulted in worse outcomes. Talbot says maybe, probably. But Edward, I do not know. I calculate, and the numbers still refuse to lie. The numbers still refuse to simplify. The numbers say that my choices resulted in 175,000 net deaths. Edward stands up. Edward walks to the window. Edward looks out at Cambridge. Edward says, Father, I did not come here for you to convince me not to take the project. Edward says I came here to tell you that I am taking the project. Edward says I have already decided. Edward says I wanted you to know before I told the War Office yes. Talbot stands up. Talbot says, Edward, you do not know what you are choosing. Talbot says once you begin this path, there is no leaving it. Talbot says you will carry these numbers for the rest of your life. Talbot says you will fill notebooks with the dead, like I have filled notebooks. Talbot says you will become hollow, like I have become hollow. Edward turns from the window. Edward's face is completely serious. Edward says, Father, I know exactly what I am choosing. Edward says, I have watched you for 34 years. I have watched you carry this weight. I have watched you choose calculation over refusal. Edward says, I have asked myself every day whether you were right or wrong. Edward says, and I have come to a conclusion. Edward says, you were not right, and you were not wrong. Edward says you chose the harder path. You chose the path that requires knowing. You chose the path that requires carrying the weight forever. Edward walks to the notebooks. Edward picks one up. Edward reads the year on the spine. 1952. Edward says in 1952 you added 234 entries to this notebook. You recorded 234 individual calculations. You recorded 234 deaths or survivals that you had decided upon through your choices. Edward says that is not the choice of someone who is wrong. That is the choice of someone who is honest. Edward says, and I want to make that choice too. Edward says, I want to know. I want to calculate. I want to carry it. Talbot sits back down. Talbot looks at his son. Talbot sees that Edward is completely serious. Talbot sees that Edward understands exactly what he is choosing. Talbot says then, you will need these. Talbot opens the drawer of his desk. Talbot pulls out a leather-bound notebook. The notebook is empty. The notebook is waiting. Talbot hands it to Edward. Talbot says, this is the first notebook. You will fill this with your first year of calculations. You will record every death, every casualty reduction, every net number. You will know exactly what you have done. Edward takes the notebook. Edward holds it like it is a living thing. Edward says, "Thank you, Father." Talbot says, "Do not thank me." Talbot says, "You are about to begin a journey that will hollow you out from the inside. You will never be the person you were before you open this notebook." Edward opens the notebook and writes on the first page. Edward writes the year, 1964. Edward writes the location, Cambridge University. Edward writes a single sentence. Edward writes, quote, "The improvement will result in approximately 176,000 net deaths across all projected applications." Unquote. Edward closes the notebook. Edward places it on the table between himself and his father. Edward says, "When this notebook is full, I will begin another. When I have filled one notebook, then I will fill another. When I have filled 100 notebooks, I will have recorded an entire life of choices. Father, I will carry this weight with you now." Edward says, "And then someday, perhaps my son will carry it with me. Perhaps the weight will pass down through our family like a curse. Perhaps in 200 years, someone will open a notebook and see the mark of what I chose today. Perhaps that will matter." Talbot looks at the notebook on the table. Talbot sees his son's handwriting on the first page. Talbot sees the number, 176,000. Talbot understands now that he has passed the weight to his son. Talbot understands that Edward will carry this weight for the rest of his life. Talbot understands that the choice that Talbot made 40 years ago has now become Edward's choice. Talbot understands that the cycle will continue. Talbot picks up the notebook. Talbot reads Edward's first entry. Talbot then picks up his first notebook from 1946. Talbot opens it. Talbot reads the first entry. Quote, 23,500 British soldiers saved, 31,800 German soldiers dead. Unquote. Talbot closes the notebook. Talbot places it next to Edward's notebook. Talbot says, "Edward, do you know what this number means?" Edward says, "Yes, Father. It means you chose to build the first system. It means you calculated carefully. It means you have lived with this choice for 18 years. Talbot says, "Edward, it means something else. It means that I did not refuse. It means that Klaus Brenner refused, and I did not. It means that somewhere in Germany there is a ghost of a man named Klaus Brenner who refused to improve killing. Klaus Brenner is dead now. Klaus Brenner died believing his refusal mattered. Klaus Brenner died believing his conscience was clean. Talbot says Klaus Brenner was wrong. Talbot says, I understood this truth at the end of my life. I understood it too late. Talbot says Klaus Brenner understood nothing at the end of his. Talbot says Klaus Brenner died in comfort and ignorance. Talbot says, I have lived in discomfort and knowledge. I believe I have lived better. Edward says, Father, I do not know if you have lived better. Edward says, but I believe you have lived more honestly. Edward says, and I want to live honestly too. Edward says, I want to know exactly what I have done. Edward says, I want to carry that knowledge forever. Edward says, and when my own son comes to me with this same question, I will hand him a notebook and tell him to begin. Edward says, and the cycle will continue. Edward says, and perhaps someday, the cycle will stop, but not today. Not while the choice exists. Not while the calculation is possible. Talbot nods. Talbot understands. Talbot understands that he has created something that will outlive him. Talbot understands that the weight will pass down through generations. Talbot understands that the choice to know will be repeated endlessly. Talbot says, then, we begin your calculations tomorrow. Talbot says, I will teach you everything I know. I will teach you how to calculate precisely. I will teach you how to carry the weight. I will teach you that innovation is not a choice between good and evil. Innovation is a choice about which type of death you prefer. Innovation is a choice about whether you want to know or whether you want to pretend. Edward nods. Edward places the notebook carefully on the shelf. Edward places it next to his father's notebooks. Edward says, "Tomorrow then. Tomorrow we begin." That night, Talbot returns home to his small cottage. Talbot sits at his kitchen table. Talbot thinks about Klaus Brenner. Talbot thinks about the memo that Brenner left behind. Talbot thinks about Brenner's refusal that meant nothing. Talbot thinks about his own choice that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Talbot thinks about Edward. Talbot thinks about the notebook that Edward has opened. Talbot thinks about the cycle that will continue. Talbot pulls out a pen. Talbot writes a letter. The letter is addressed to his son. Talbot writes, quote, "Edward, by the time you read this, I will be dead. I will have filled as many notebooks as I could in the time I was given. I do not know how many that will be. Perhaps 50, perhaps 100, perhaps fewer. What I know is that every notebook represents a choice. Every notebook represents a moment when I chose to know instead of refusing to know. Every notebook represents the weight that I chose to carry." Unquote. Talbot continues writing. Talbot writes, quote, "I want you to understand something. The War Office will tell you that your calculations matter. They will tell you that your choices save lives. They will tell you that your innovations benefit humanity. Do not believe them. Your calculations do not matter. Your choices do matter, but not in the way they tell you. Your choices matter because you are honest about what they cost." Unquote. Talbot writes the final paragraph. Quote, "Somewhere in you there is something that sees clearly. Somewhere in you there is the ability to calculate precisely. Somewhere in you there is the strength to carry the weight. Use that. But know this. Klaus Brenner saw clearly too. Klaus Brenner calculated precisely too. Klaus Brenner had the strength to carry the weight, but Klaus Brenner refused. And Klaus Brenner was wrong. Do not be Klaus Brenner. Be someone better. Be someone who knows." Unquote. Talbot signs the letter. Talbot places it in an envelope. Talbot addresses it to Edward. Talbot does not mail it. Talbot leaves it on his desk. Talbot knows that Edward will find it someday. Talbot knows that Edward will read it and understand. Talbot knows that the cycle will continue after Talbot is dead. Talbot knows that the notebooks will continue to fill. Talbot knows that the weight will continue to pass down through the generations like a curse or a responsibility or both. Talbot closes his eyes. Talbot sits in the darkness of his cottage. Talbot thinks about innovation. Talbot thinks about the fact that innovation is not progress. Innovation is not improvement. Innovation is only the choice to do something that was not done before. Talbot thinks about the fact that doing something that was not done before always results in consequences that were not felt before. Talbot thinks about the fact that he will die knowing exactly what his choices have cost. Talbot thinks about the fact that his son will also die knowing exactly what his choices have cost. Talbot thinks about the fact that this knowledge will be inherited like a genetic curse. Talbot thinks about the fact that this is better than the alternative. Talbot thinks about the fact that knowing is always better than refusing. Talbot opens his eyes. Talbot looks at the letter he has written to Edward. Talbot reads the words one final time. Talbot reads, quote, "Be someone better. Be someone who knows." Unquote. Talbot understands that these words will define his son's life. Talbot understands that Edward will carry these words and these notebooks and these calculations until the day Edward dies. Talbot understands that when Edward's own son asks the same question, Edward will give the same answer. Talbot understands that the cycle will continue forever. Talbot understands that this is what inheritance means. Talbot understands that this is the burden that he has chosen to pass down. Choosing honesty over innocence is harder, but it's the only way to live. If you're ready to face uncomfortable truths, subscribe.